All right. Good morning. I hope you guys are doing well. I want to go over my most recent post with the crime of 1873, which was really because of the Coinage Act of 1873, um, also known as the Mint Act of 1873, right? Um, so, one thing you notice with these government or with a lot of legislation is they have many names for some reason. Anyways, here's a cartoon sort of that'll make more sense when we get through it, right? I'll come back to this. I'll do that instead. So has a lot to do with like the original definition of the U.S. dollar, right? So the United States dollar was originally defined in grains of silver, right? Um, and then the value of gold was 15 times that. It was a 15-to-1 ratio. Um, excuse me. And I was pretty much fixed because back then we were on a bimetallic system, so we had gold and silver, and that was the actual money that we used, um, or at least the base money. Anyways, and then around this time, if you notice the date 1873, this is right after the Civil War, right? And so naturally, especially after a Civil War, um, the public confidence in the government wasn't very high, to say the least. And so basically, people would hoard real money like gold and silver because it was a crisis period and they didn't know what they were like. They didn't know what was going to happen. And so you just hold money and everything else because you want to preserve as much as you can. So the hoarding of this caused the prices to increase. Um, and then over in the West, the comptroller of the currency, John J. Knox, at the time, foresaw an increase in the production of silver, right? Because of multiple like silver mines and various things like um, looking to come into production relatively soon, back then at least, and increase the supply of silver. And so he thought this would, excuse me, this could endanger the bimetallic system of the United States. Because basically all the government had, because at this time almost the entire world, at least to my knowledge, used gold and silver at least as base money to do any transactions, especially with foreign countries. And so nowadays we have like quantitative easing and stuff like that to put more bank reserves and to give them to commercial banks. Um, this one, back then, the government just used this gold to silver ratio. So, like, well, forget the name of the act, but they later changed this to 16 times, which we see here. This is what this alludes to. It's 16-to-1 ratio. And we'll get more into that in a minute. Um, so, yeah. And so afterwards, he was right. And the price of silver dropped after they passed the bill. Um, And then when the silver miners and such took their silver to the US Mint, they could no longer have it struck in the silver bullion. There we go. So essentially what this bill did was it demonetized silver. Silver was no longer considered like money, quote unquote. Um, but it seems like it's rather argued whether or not this is was on purpose, right? It seems because senators and such back then were more concerned on the omission of a coinage charge, right? Which is the fee that the mint services is con- it's the fee for the mint in converting the actual metal into the silver coins, right? And so this affected how much money the miners and refiners could maintain. What this act actually did was it essentially redefined. It didn't essentially. It did redefine the dollar in terms of gold only, right? Um, so silver was no longer directly tied to the U.S. dollar. Um, which is why it's called demonetized. And then later, by the Specie Payment Resumption Act of 1875, um, it was no longer considered silver was no longer considered legal tender for debts above $5 as well. Um, but the greenbacks, the green pieces of paper, could still be redeemed for silver and stuff. But like the miners and people couldn't have just hunks of silver. They could no longer have those struck into legal tender dollar coins. So there was a big that coinage charge wasn't a thing. So what did this do? Basically, the price of silver plummeted, and so the price of gold increased dramatically, especially relative to silver, right? Because you have this it was mostly supply and demand since people couldn't actually so almost they couldn't sell their silver because the government had essentially legislated one of the biggest buyers out of the market, right? Because there was no longer a the mint was no longer buying silver, and so people didn't have many people to sell it to, and so basically that meant people wanted to sell. They wanted to trade it for gold, right? So it created much more demand for gold and less for silver because not many people wanted to get silver because it had lost that utility to become money. Um, li- Lost that ability to become legal tender, I should say. Um, so yeah, and naturally, one of the reasons why this is such a big deal is because silver was considered more of like the people's money. Because again, it's the ratio from silver to gold was 16 to 1 at this point. Um, and so people who had smaller debts, comparatively, who weren't seen as particularly wealthy, like the miners and uh, I don't know why farmers, um, they don't have a lot of they don't have a lot. And so they used silver primarily instead of gold because gold was 16 times more expensive. Um, and so this significantly hurt um, regular people, not people who were not considered wealthy, who had like a bunch of gold and such. So naturally, the government comes in and another series of legislation to do their own thing. This includes like the Bland-Allison Act, which happened in 1878, which was basically to appease the miners in the West and other silver supporters, and basically force the United States Treasury to buy $2 to $4 million in silver every month, right? Um, and then the Sherman Silver Purchase Act required the government to buy an additional 4.5 million ounces of silver um, monthly. Um, so, yeah, and they would do this typically through gold notes. Um, so, like, almost like certificates on gold notes. Um, anyways, so this essentially drove silver out of circulation. Um, in terms of in a monetary sense. Another thing to keep in mind is we were on a bimetallic system, and so you had two metals, and so basically you took away half the money supply almost overnight. And so that means there's a lot fewer currency units to a certain amount of goods and services, right? Which means the prices have to come down because there's not enough money to, unless it's just unless there's just so much or not volatility, velocity, then you're not going to have enough money to keep prices the same. The prices will depress down, which is great from a consumer perspective. If consumer prices deflate because things get cheaper. Um, but if you're on the other end, and for producers, and also for people who have a lot of debt or have debt. This can be terrible because essentially each currency unit has more purchasing power because there's less of them, right? So the value of the currency unit, in this case a dollar, increased, right, or gold. Um, and so those debts that you had, the nominal value that they had were stayed the same, but each individual unit was worth more. You had to produce more value to get the same amount of currency units as you did before. And so that means your debt in real terms is significantly larger. Um, and so it's believed that this whole fiasco basically led to the series of the financial panics in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Um, so it's one major lesson, at least that I saw in this stuff, is you need to understand that what your debt is denominated in, right? And so whether that's a currency or she sales or whatever, doesn't matter. Um, yeah, because if you don't, this is something that foreign investors have to deal with all the time because they're dealing with currency plays and stuff like that. But if you're like as an American or whatever and you're investing in the United States, you typically don't think of anything outside of dollars unless you have invested in foreign countries or that's something you've studied to where like you understand more of like how to play currencies and what the whole how big of a deal the denomination of your debt is. Um, so yeah, two of the major things that at least popped up for me was that the economy and financial health of the country is heavily influenced by the type and amount of the money supply. Right? In this case, silver was gone, so we only had gold, so we had a lot less money supply in terms of nominal value. And then also the fact that it was silver and that was more of the people's money and that was demonetized had a significant effect, right? And then another thing too that I noticed is sometimes the government doesn't always think of possible unintended consequences, right? And now I quoted a historian in the act, Helen Weinstein. Oh, there we go. And most likely it wasn't on purpose. It was just kind of a oops, because especially since they basically just redefined the dollar in terms of gold, and so we didn't actually officially become on the gold standard until the Gold Standard Act of 1900, um, which this just kind of aided that in a way, which is what I was going to get to when I get up here with our little comic. I don't need the caption or whatever. So you see the two gladiators. You got the gold standard, and then you got the silver. Um, and you see that the sword saying 16 to 1 is broken of silver. This was the gold to silver ratio that was set by the government. Oh, another thing. I think I stated earlier that the ratio was how they fucking Christ. The ratio was how the government controlled basically the relative prices of the metals, right? Because otherwise if silver started to get way too expensive because there was a lot less silver than there was gold in the country, um, relatively, um, then people would essentially use the silver to buy gold and they would search for like arbitrage plays. And basically, so like if metal started to get really expensive here, people would start to from foreign countries would start buying the gold because it was cheaper or however you would like. There's multiple ways to do it, but essentially people would do arbitrage plays, and so you'd see massive influxes and outfluxes of the different metals to different countries, And there's other examples of this stuff within. Why are you here? Anyways, within your within history. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Pretty. I started to in terms of the blog or whatever. This isn't really much on the post, but there's supposed to be an ad here run by Google. I don't know. It's another reason why I do these live streams, so there's only one take, and so you can watch me screw up. Everything else works, so. But yeah, I don't really know what it is there. I'll have to look into it. Anyways, same with this. This is probably for the ad, but I don't know. Anyways, sorry if I seem kind of groggy or slow or whatever. It's 5:08 here. I just wanted to get this done because I get up at 4 and to go to work by 6. Um, and my cooling down coffee is right here. So I'm not quite awake just yet. But I didn't feel too bad about doing this. Oh yeah, that's shit, that's right. Here's the actual piece of legislation if you want to look at it. I found this PDF online. Um, I believe it was at a government website. I forgot. But we'll see as soon as you click the URL and stuff. Whichever government website does the legislation and stuff. But here's the actual words. So, and then just links, references, and some other places to look at some more stuff on my site. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Let's go back here. All right. Well, I hope you guys have a good day, and I'll see you on the next video. And